About a couple anniversaries, and that's the first is the anniversary of the coup in Myanmar. That was the first anniversary was February 1st. The military there seized power from what they called the civilian government. I think all of that is, very loose. The leader was Aung San Suu Kyi, and she had previously won a Nobel Peace Prize. I think the military did and always maintained a good amount of power in Myanmar, but it's not like they had seized control of the country as they had now, and at least she did exist as somewhat in control of the government. Now, there's a lot of attention paid to her for winning the Nobel Peace Prize, and I don't know a whole lot about that. I am aware that in 2017, the Myanmar military carried out an ethnic cleansing campaign against the Rohingya Muslim minority, killing thousands and displacing nearly a million, at least hundreds of thousands. And these people, for the past 4 years, have lived in absolute poverty and squalor in refugee camps in Bangladesh. They're absolutely unwanted there. They put them in terrible locations that flood. People have been killed by being trampled to death by elephants. They've tried to move them to remote islands that frequently flood. It's a humanitarian disaster. And throughout that, Aung San Suu Kyi did apologize and cover for the military in that ethnic cleansing campaign in the international stage. And so she's not that sympathetic of a figure. That being said, the military government, the military was the ones that carried out the ethnic cleansing campaign and have carried out a pretty brutal down on the people who have risen up against this coup. Now, if you're talking to somebody about this coup and they say there was a coup in Myanmar, tell them that they'll remember this because there was the school teacher doing the daily social distanced COVID exercises on video, and she's out there there's a staircase and she's doing whatever, and you see in the background behind her a bunch of military vehicles rolling by, and apparently they were going to carry out the coup. Now, in the year since the coup, they've carried out, I think, a mostly sham trial against the former leader, and she was sentenced to 4 years in prison. I think part of that was they claimed she possessed walkie-talkies or something like that. Initially, it was a longer sentence. They shortened it, but then they brought her up on new charges anyways, and so I think at her age, she's in her 70s, if not going on 80 now. It's likely they'll just keep her in prison for the rest of her life and, use whatever court and judicial trick that they need, that there's really no justice here and that, we shouldn't take any of the charges against her as being true, I guess. The crackdown by the military has continued. There are, and I guess has always existed, separatist or rebellion groups in Myanmar. It's not that they formed in response to the coup. There's I think the Arcane Army, Rohingya have their own militant groups. The government there has accused them of being tied to Al Qaeda. I don't know if it's true. There's this Karen minority group that has a couple different of their own militias, and apparently they're using 3D printed guns to resist the ruling military there. There's this very interesting article by the Observer's France 24, how rebel fighters are using 3D printed arms to fight the Myanmar junta. I recommend going and checking it out if you're interested in 3D printing and everything like that. My main interest here is I wonder where this is going to pop up next and how significant it's going to be if we start to see 3D printing being used more and more by insurgency groups. I think we've seen somewhat from the ability to machine and build drones easily, how cheap it is to program these things, that, the Houthis, that Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, the Palestinians have been able to mount pretty serious campaigns against very powerful governments with the limited technology that they have. And if 3D printing will become a part of this and more significant in these groups. Also, some to keep your eye on if 3D printers start popping up in Somalia or different countries. Maybe there's some government that's more or less behind what's happening here. As a part of our responding to the coup, the U.S. put on sanctions against the Myanmar government and the Myanmar society in general. In celebration of the 1 year anniversary, I guess, the U.S. announced a new round of sanctions. And then we just had yesterday the U.S. envoy for Myanmar saying that the U.S. is not finished with sanctions yet. These sanctions are causing a real problem in Myanmar. This from the UN International Labor Organization. Myanmar on the brink of economic collapse 1 year after military coup. And so, we're just seeing another country that's being punished, and who knows how bad the humanitarian crisis is there. I'm not sure if, people are starving yet, but certainly becoming a lot more poor, a lot more food insecure, and the U.S. sanctions are playing a big role in that. It may be bad that the government, was overthrown and that the people want a return of Aung San Suu Kyi into power, but the U.S. can't do that through sanctions, and there's probably a lot of unintended consequences and a lot of punishment for the people of Myanmar because of that. All right, the other anniversary I want to talk about, and something I think that could be very relevant here, is that the U.S. sanctions the country and then just doesn't take it away. And we see that with the 60th anniversary of the Cuban trade embargo. This by William Leo Grande at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Excellent article on the embargo. If somebody doesn't know anything about it, very easy to share and get them somewhat caught up on the details. Article titled "Today Marked 60 Years of the Cuban Embargo. What exactly is it?" He breaks it down to a bunch of subheads, and so he says, what exactly is the embargo against Cuba? The embargo is shorthand for a complex patchwork of laws and regulations that comprise the oldest and most comprehensive U.S. sanctions against any country in the world. And then he actually goes through and explains that there's like several different rounds of things that happened here. The Cuban Democracy Act of 1992 authorizes humanitarian donations of food and medicine and the sale of telecommunications services and medical supplies, albeit subject to detailed restrictions. It also prohibits trade between subsidiaries of U.S. companies abroad and Cuba. The U.S. Cuban Literacy and Democracy Solidarity Act of 1996 inscribes the embargo into law until Cuba becomes a multi-party free market democracy and pays compensation for property nationalized by the revolutionary government. And you have the Trade Sanctions Reform and Export Enhancement Act of 2000. Legalize the sale of agricultural commodities to Cuba, but only for cash in advance, which isn't the way international trade in agriculture is done. The Trump administration's designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of international terrorism under the Export Administration Act of 1979 triggered a variety of economic sanctions, although most are already in place under the embargo. However, now to get the embargo and economic sanctions off of Cuba, not only does it have to be a state that is a free market democracy with multiple parties, but also has to be certified by the United States as not being a terror country. And we've seen with countries like Sudan, the way Sudan actually got off of the terrorism list wasn't by not supporting terrorism anymore, but rather by paying a bribe to the U.S. government to be taken off the list. He says in here that the embargo was initially put in place after the U.S. property was nationalized in Cuba, and that it's just kind of become part of U.S. security establishment over time. The next part of this that I really wanted to mention is that he highlights in here that can the president lift the embargo unilaterally? He says legally he probably could, politically he probably won't. And that's the really unfortunate part about this embargo, is that it does significantly impact the Cuban economy. And while the socialism of Cuba hasn't helped anything, it's millions of dollars a year. Any kind of business done with Cuba has to be done in a special way to avoid U.S. sanctions that cost more money. It's not done the rest of the way throughout the world. And so it cuts Cuba off of a large part of the world economy. That's why it does business with countries like Venezuela and Russia and things like that, because these are other states that are heavily sanctioned by the U.S. and are less concerned about it incurring secondary sanctions or whatever from the United States. All right, so one of the things I guess about the Cuba embargo in relation to Myanmar is just that, the sanctions go on, but then they're not removed unless the governments absolutely change. Well, if the governments don't end up changing, then the sanctions stay in place forever and just indefinitely impoverish an entire nation of people.